Hi guys, this is Dr. John. Is addiction a spiritual disease? I'm going to suggest that it is, and not just in what it does to the spirit or essence of a person, but also in the opportunity it presents for one to become spiritually realized in recovery. Recovery from addiction shows, in retrospect, how spiritual addiction is because in genuine recovery, the spirit comes alive. And I don't necessarily mean spirit in a religious sense, but by spirit, I mean the deepest part of ourselves, the part that we may only be in touch with occasionally, right? When we have one of those epiphany moments where the beyond is tangible. That is the resource we need and indeed look for in recovery. That is the higher power, so to speak, we need to recover. Some people, through religious or spiritual practices, do regularly tap into this essential energy, but it is accessible to everyone who honestly seeks it. And when do people most honestly and openly seek spiritual truth or energy? When they are down and desperate. That is why the addiction literature describes the addict's bottom as the place where we find the, quote, gift of desperation. This is one of those, this is where those of us in recovery were able to accept help, admit our state of addiction, our powerlessness by ourselves to change and start a new way of life, clean. Let's look at the dark side of addiction for a moment. It's not hard to see where addiction takes a person in terms of damaging their innermost selves if you've experienced or watched closely or witnessed closely severe drug addiction. Eventually, one's inner world constricts to the point where no one else exists except for me. And no one else matters, or nothing else matters except for my next fix, right? I've been in that dark place. And at least for me, while in addiction, I was unable to sense that higher part of myself, my spirit, if you will, that part of me which is connected to all, to eternity. That is not to say that the universe or God abandoned me, but that I went to a place where I was incapable of responding to grace or love, however it was offered to me. That's what giving myself completely over to addiction did to me, and what opioids did to my human brain. I believe many other channels, or excuse me, I believe that many other chemicals can be substituted here for opioids, including alcohol and many other drugs. But I was in a place where, unless I somehow broke out of my self-centered cocoon and reached out a hand for help, I was terminally trapped. Did I have a choice about using that next drug? Most of the time, I could honestly perceive no other choice. Occasionally, the idea of another choice or that option, like asking for help, or what seemed like a vague and distant offer of help, did seem almost real. But this option seemed nearly as terrifying as living on the street and hustling. So I tried as best as I could just to make it through the moment I was in and not think about it. And so my existence was consumed with using opioid drugs and the obsessive drive to find ways to obtain and use more. Near my bottom, I could go for hours or even a day without thinking about anyone besides myself and my opioid-induced fantasies. But as soon as I became partly conscious of my life's dereliction, I would rush again to use, to suppress the shame and ugliness of what my life was and who I thought I was. I remember praying and trying to meditate while using. I often prayed to find a way out of my using life, out of the deep dereliction and addiction I was in. At the same time, I didn't really want with all of my heart to change, partly because stopping meant going through the agony of withdrawal and an ongoing life without the protection from my feelings that drugs gave me. It's those damn feelings. Unmanageable thoughts and feelings were at the root of my addiction and are at the root of all addictions. Yet I did accept help and got clean on a couple of occasions and have been clean for years today, which means to me that my spirit was not dead. and that the connection between my essence and being was not broken, nor is it ever broken, no matter how sick a human being may appear. Today I know this. No one is ever beyond the reach of help. I don't know how many of you are familiar with M. Scott Peck, MD, who wrote the book "The Road Less Traveled," but he also has an lecture called "Addiction: The Sacred Disease," and in this lecture, he shares his observation that persons who suffer from alcoholism and drug addiction are actually blessed. In the sense that they often find spiritual realization, the same spiritual realization that all humans seek through devotion to a program, specifically a 12-step program. And while there's nothing quick or easy about working the 12 steps, Dr. Peck calls them a, quote, fast track to spiritual enlightenment, because anyone can work them, and those who have suffered an addiction are often the most highly motivated to do that work. 12-step programs make the most sense when approached from a place where a person is broken, from a place of brokenness and humility, when addiction has taken over a person's life and they've been rendered unable by themselves to change. A lot of you who are in recovery listening to this obviously already know this. But the steps themselves, if followed, are a pathway to spiritual enlightenment. They begin with admitting one's need for help, finding hope and believing in the love of a higher power, both inside and beyond ourselves. And anyone experienced with one of the anonymous programs which use these steps will be familiar with the final step of the process, which states, having had a spiritual awakening as a result of these steps, we try to carry this message to others and practice these principles in all our affairs. So the goal is personal and spiritual transformation. And in my own recovery, I've witnessed this magnitude of change in myself and dozens of other individuals, if not hundreds. Addictions of all kinds, but particularly substance addictions, are known to wreak havoc in lives and bring persons to a place of tremendous loss and suffering. To the extent that we humans need to confront our suffering in order to understand our reason for being and find purpose in our lives, in the greater order of things, in order to find God, if you will, those whose lives are interrupted completely, or those whose lives are shattered by addiction, are indeed presented an existential opportunity through the step process or any similar process, which forces human beings to confront the big questions in life, which we all must confront, but all too often avoid. In this sense, I'm really grateful for my addiction, because it brought me to that place of desperation and willingness to accept help, which led me to recovery and led me to the steps. Recovery looks different for different people, but for me, the 12-step model continues to be a bedrock of personal and spiritual growth, and it is one which can accommodate any prior religious tradition or none at all. The good news about having a spiritual disease is that today I get to live in a spiritual treatment or a spiritual solution, one I would have needed and searched for regardless of whether I ever became an addict or not, regardless of whether I ever picked up a drug in the first place. So for me, yes, addiction is definitely a spiritual disease. So in summary, life in active addiction is one of dysfunction, aloneness, impairment, and total self-centeredness. It eventually becomes a living insanity, contaminating every aspect of one's personhood. Make no mistake, even using addicts who may appear to be oblivious to the world and the people around them suffer. Ongoing active addiction is a place to which people may capitulate or resign themselves to sometimes, but it is never where they truly wish to be. No one wants to be living in an illness, An active addiction is living with a disease that is out of control. At the same time, I don't believe that a person's essence or spirit ever dies, and it is precisely that part of us which can respond to what recovery has to offer. Thank you. You've been watching Shooting Up in the Dark video series. This is John Bray Morris, and I'll see you again soon.